My Grandpa's Angry Russian Friend by Spooky Skeleton. Back when I was a kid, Grandpa found a lot of humor in stories that didn't really seem to have a punchline, but were just weird situations. I think he made me realize that's the best sense of humor to have, because it makes you appreciate the oddities of life more. Back when my grandpa was a kid in the 60s, he was exploring his future as a broadcasting technician by playing with a ham radio. G-Pa actually helped me get my own ham license when I was 13, since there are a lot of rules and regulations you need to know about before you can operate these radios. They can call out to anyone on that channel, and it's just a matter of scanning all of the frequencies until you hear someone reaching out to you. There's several hours of lectures and training about how you shouldn't mess around on these radios, because someone may mistake it for an actual emergency. To avoid temptation, Grandpa just liked to listen. His funny story he liked to tell me repeatedly, always with a bit of ethnocentric humor, was the night he met his Russian friend. Communism was still a massively negative subject to most Americans, so G-Pa was immediately hooked when he heard an angry Russian voice calling out on a frequency one April night as he was fiddling with the radio. The voice was male, frantic, and angry at the same time, crying out in what seemed to be rage or fear in their silly, phlegmy accent. Grandpa would laugh. No one else seemed to be responding to the communications, so G-Pa stayed silent. The way he would always tell the story made it seem like he was about to interfere with a Russian spy scandal. But if that's what it really was, the communication was one-sided. The voice became increasingly staticky and metallic as the voice began to cut in and out. G-Pa never understood Russian, of course, but it almost sounded like praying, although Grandpa thinks Russians don't have a religion. Grandpa was going to respond to this guy, he always said, but before he did, he was distracted by a quick glance outside his window. A massive comet was streaking across the sky, burning brightly. Grandpa was awestruck and made a wish, although he never told me what he wished for. He forgot about his Russian friend and went to bed, because the transmission had stopped and static blasted through the channel.
I've gone all over the world to find the best food. 6 continents, thousands of regions, countless dishes, all in search of the perfect meal. For a while, I thought it may never happen. There was always something a little off. Salt, freshness, temperature. Tiny, niggling complaints that, to anyone else, would be meaningless. To me, though, they were the difference between perfection and mundanity. Thus my quest went on. During my travels, I learned about an underground supper club in Moscow, which met once a year. While underground supper club sounds mysterious and illicit, it's just a place that operates casually, meaning without a food license. Chefs all over do it all the time for their friends. I've been to many. This one was supposed to be different, though. They had the best caviar. Caviar is a luxury dream. But even in luxury-obsessed Russia, it started to fall out of favor because of sustainability issues. It's still widely available, but the good stuff is getting harder and harder to find. The best stuff is nearly impossible to get a hold of. It's locked down by the oligarchs and heads of the state. If you're not one of them, or in close company, you're out of luck. So when I heard that the supper club would be serving the best of the best, I knew I had to get in there. and it wasn't easy. It took 4 bloody years to ingratiate myself with the influential Moscow foodies. I spent thousands upon thousands of euros at their restaurants, building a reputation, blogging BS about their food, and cultivating relationships. Vasily Prochenko, a restaurateur and minor celebrity in Moscow, noticed me. Over time, we became friends. I didn't know if he was privy to the supper club or not, but if anyone was, he had to be one of them. I didn't say anything though. I waited. One afternoon, Vasily and I were talking about caviar, specifically the best sources. He mentioned the waters of Japan, which I found strange, since the Fukushima disaster had scared people away from certain types of fish in that area. He agreed that it was moderately disconcerting, but insisted that the caviar from the fish in those waters was sublime. Then it happened. "You know," he told me, "there's something even better. Something practically nobody knows about. Can you keep a secret?" I did my best to contain my excitement. This had been what I had been waiting for. "Of course," I told him, and leaned in to listen. Vasily told me about the supper club. There were 20 chefs and a few of their close friends from all around the world. They met in a restaurant right down the street from Vasily's, and if I was willing to pitch in the 5,000 euro entry fee and keep my mouth shut, I would be allowed to attend. 1 hour and a trip to the bank later, I had the 5,000. All I had to do was wait. On the evening of the supper, I met with Vasily at his restaurant and had a drink. Then we walked down to the meeting place, which had a sign in front saying it was closed for the weekend. We walked around to the back of the kitchen and opened the door. The kitchen was full of chefs. Some of the chefs I recognized from my travels, but others were strangers. All were busy preparing dishes for the evening. We sat in the main dining room and I admired the decor. The room was softly candlelit and the windows had been covered in black paper. It was obvious this was a private event and no prying eyes were allowed. "So, how does this all work?" I asked Vasily. "They just start bringing out the courses. They're small, obviously, so you can sample all of them. The caviar will be at the end, I think. It is the rarest and most special of all the dishes." True to his word, the food began to arrive. We were treated to sumptuous course upon course, prepared by the meticulous and downright genius minds of the master chefs. I must confess I ate and drank until my head spun. Vasily excused himself and went to the kitchen. I chatted with some of the other diners and learned many were like me, rich foodies looking to experience the best of the best. After a little while and a few more courses, someone near the kitchen clapped their hands to get everyone's attention. To my surprise, it was Vasily. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he announced. "The evening, as always, has been an incredible success. We've sampled food from the greatest chefs around the world, and as is customary, we like to end the night with something very special. You all know I am passionate about my caviar. You've had the best from all over. Russia, Japan, Canada, etc., etc. Tonight, I have another treat. It's something extremely rare and takes a very long time to produce in quantities fit for consumption." A parade of servers carrying silver trays emerged from the kitchen. They swarmed around the room, placing plates of food in front of each diner. Vasily continued, "This is the culmination of a year's work. I had to pull a lot of strings and grease a lot of palms to bring this to you tonight. But for the first time, I would like to share with you this caviar." It is without doubt the rarest caviar on the planet, and I believe it is the most exquisite as well. Please, please, enjoy." Everyone applauded, and Vasily bowed and came back to me. "I had no idea you were behind the caviar," I exclaimed. Vasily just grinned. "I wanted you to be surprised," he admitted. Now, please, eat. Let me know what you think." I looked down at my plate. There was a toast point, perfectly browned, covered with a reddish-brown paste. Atop the paste was a dollop of creme fraiche, flecked with green pieces of dill. Oh, my mouth watered. I brought it to my mouth and bit. My eyelids closed, and I chewed, savoring the taste. It was thick and briny, with distinct livery notes. It was unlike any caviar I'd had in the past, and it was undoubtedly spectacular. I took another bite, and then another. The complexity of the flavor profile was mind-boggling. Without realizing it, I began grinning like an idiot the whole time. Vasily asked, "So, what do you think?" I swallowed and said, "It's the most incredible thing I've ever tasted, Vasily. It's so smooth and buttery. There's none of the intense saltiness or pop of normal caviar, and I initially missed it. But the notes of the liver came through and coated my tongue. Where is it from?" "North Korea," Vasily said. "My God," I replied. "How did you get access to those waters without being shot?" "Well, here's the thing," Vasily told me. "I know a special person. He's a doctor over there." I picked up my last piece and ate it while Vasily talked. I knew I'd never be able to fish in North Korean waters. But the first time the doctor and I talked, I realized he had access to this caviar without even knowing it. Over the years, I paid him a lot of money to collect it for me. I looked up, puzzled. "So the doctor brought you the fish?" Vasily laughed. No. The doctor isn't a fisherman. He's a specialist. He has no time for fish." A specialist in what?" I inquired, profoundly confused. "Gynecology," Vasily told me. "They're really into forced sterilizations over there. It's bad for them, but great for us. Without it, we wouldn't have any of this caviar." The room seemed to darken, and I felt my mouth getting very wet and very dry at the same time. I formed the words, Vasily, what kind of caviar is this?" The chef grinned. "Why, lady caviar."
The Russian Nesting Dolls by Manon Lysett. Throughout my childhood, I wondered what was in the box my father kept on the mantel. He'd given my sister and I clear instructions never to touch it, in a tone of voice so authoritative that we dared not give in to our curiosity. Our only clue was a small label on its side that read, "Russian Nesting Dolls." Since none of the boxes in the house were properly labeled, we weren't sure what to make of it. I only discovered the truth one night several years ago, when my father and I were sharing drinks and watching a hockey game. I confess I was not expecting what he told me and showed me that night. I think that had it not been for the half-dozen Molsons he'd downed that evening, he would never have opened the box in front of me. My dad pushed his recliner back, a bottle in his hand, and watched the Zamboni make its way onto the ice. With a quiet sip, he began telling me the story. Much to my surprise, he revealed that he had an older sister, Jessie. Up until then, I thought Uncle Steve was his only sibling. When my dad was 7 years old, Jessie got into a car accident after a night on the town. Automobile versus tree, and the tree won by a landslide. The damage was so severe that Jessie needed a closed casket funeral. Dad's only man insisted that they cremate her body. Once Dad had gotten a little older, his mother revealed more details about the accident. A branch had taken Jessie's head nearly entirely off her shoulders, and her body had been crushed and twisted at unnatural angles. Some of the rescue workers on the scene, seasoned professionals used to blood and gore, quit their jobs after that night. As my father spoke, he pushed himself off the couch and walked over to the box on the mantel. I asked if her ashes were inside, but he shook his head. He brought the box over to the sofa, took a seat, and ran his hand delicately against its grainy surface. After a slight moment of hesitation, my father pushed open the small wooden slab at the front of the box, revealing a Russian nesting doll tucked neatly in a bed of straw. He told me the box had come in the mail exactly 10 years to the day after his sister's death. There was no postmark or return address. He turned the slab over to expose a sentence written in red ink. "I will always be with you," it read. The name Jessie had been signed underneath, and the dot on the I had been replaced with a heart. Dad insisted it was her handwriting, and tears welled up in his eyes as he gently grazed the now faded markings with the tips of his fingers. I had never seen my dad get so emotional before. It was a little uncomfortable. I took a sip of beer and leaned closer, examining the doll box. It was painted like any typical Russian nesting doll. A beautiful young woman's smiling face, a floral shawl around her neck, small arms at her sides, a rose on her stomach, and a red base. My father followed my gaze to the doll and sighed. The game came back on, and he set the conversation aside to watch, his stern face locked onto the screen. Holding my tongue until the break between the second and third periods, I barely paid attention to the television. From the disapproving groans being emitted by my dad, I could tell our team was losing again. As soon as the second period ended, I turned to my father and asked him why he never put the dolls out on display. He said he would show me why, if I was man enough to handle it. I puffed my chest in an exaggerated manner and snarled, "Me, man," in a caveman-esque voice. He clutched the doll and pried it open, pulling out the smaller one inside. She was creepier than the first, but still looked fairly normal. She had all the same features, except for two things. She was frowning, and the rose on her stomach was black. Noticing the unimpressed look on my face, he popped the second doll open. The third doll filled me with a sense of unease. Its face seemed more demonic, and small fangs protruded from its painted lips. A thorny vine had replaced the rose on its belly, and her clawed fingers gave her a monstrous appearance. Okay, I was beginning to understand why he never showed these off. My father cringed, not wanting to reveal the next doll, so I offered him another beer to soothe his nerves. A few minutes passed in silence before my father freed the fourth figure. This one really stunned me. It had devilish horns and an angry face. It looked evil. I could feel a weird pressure in my chest. Maybe it was my imagination, but I felt like it was getting harder to breathe. The doll had thick eyebrows, soulless eyes, and a goatee. Instead of a shawl around its neck, it had barbed wire. Its long, bony and clawed fingers were holding the severed head of the first doll in a series. Just looking at it made my skin crawl. God, there was something seriously wrong about it. My father downed the beer in his hands and slipped it between his knees. He plucked the doll open and showed me the fifth and final one. It was a little girl with a tormented face. She had blood dripping all around her neck. Her base was painted to look like flames. Of all the dolls, that one scared me the most. I could practically hear the anguished screams coming out of her wide open mouth. Chills ran up and down my spine as I took it in. If I wasn't freaked out enough already, my father said something that ensured I would not sleep that night. Looks just like Jessie. The arrayed dolls disturbed me greatly, and I cursed my innate curiosity. It was then that I noticed a crease in the middle of the smallest doll. Against my better judgment, I asked my father if there was another doll inside. He shook his head. His pained lips turned into a light, almost mournful smile. He carefully opened the lid, revealing something wrapped in a yellowish newspaper and tied together with twine. He slowly started to undo the knot, and my heart raced faster and faster with each passing second. I wish I could unsee what I saw that night. I knew what it was before my eyes even caught a glimpse of it. It was as if my brain had filled in the blank all on its own. Inside the newspaper was a shriveled human figure. It had been ripped off at the base, and a broken metacarpal bone stuck out of the old raisin-like flesh, dangling at the bottom. I brought a hand to my mouth and bolted towards the washroom, expulsing beer and peanuts into the porcelain throne. Why had he kept it? What if my sister and I had seen it? What if it had fallen from the mantel and somehow opened? Did Mom know? Was it even legal to keep human remains? Between the gurgles and flushes, I heard my dad slapping the dolls shut, one by one. He moved the box to his room the next morning. I never confronted him about it. One little detail kept nagging at me, and though I tried to forget about the whole thing, I couldn't get my mind off of it. How had his sister sent him her finger after she passed away? Maybe my grandmother had found the box in the garage one night and left it for Dad without checking its contents. But then, how had the finger gotten inside? I needed to know. Earlier this year, I was watering my parents' plants while they were away on vacation when I saw the box on Dad's bedside table. I took it home and ordered a DNA testing kit. Along with a few pieces of my dad's hair taken from his comb, I sent a piece of the finger to the lab. I'd forgotten all about it until today. It's not like on TV. It can take months to get results. Just so you know, all humans share about 99.5 of their DNA. The remaining 0.5 contains family markers, so to speak. Though there are exceptions, the DNA between siblings usually matches up at around 50%, as opposed to, say, fourth cousins, who match up at around 20%. Which is to say, when I received the results in the mail today, and they came back at a mere 9% match, I knew the finger did not belong to his sister. Jdet, тебя by Silly Willy 04. I'm a 28-year-old male working for a tech support company. This is the oddest, yet most disturbing thing I have ever been contacted about while working in tech support. So, let me tell you about this whole thing. I had wanted to work at a tech support company ever since I was 14, since it was actually an achievable life goal, and I, simply put, loved technology and helping people with it. So, when I was 23, I applied for a tech support job. I got the job and went to work on my first day, excited for people who needed help with their tech to call me. Within the first few months, I had encountered many problems with many different kinds of people. There were the old people who yelled at me since they installed a virus. There were nice old women asking about how to get the Google homepage. There was even a person asking how to change their main browser from Edge to Chrome. But the weirdest and most disturbing thing happened in March of this year. It was a regular Wednesday. I walked into the building, showed my ID to the receptionist, and went to my desk. Within a few hours, I got a call from a man who had a Russian accent. I introduced myself.
Hello, this is Will from the company I work for. How can I help you? Hi, Will. So this may sound really strange, but I went on a website and wanted to download a video editing software. When I downloaded it and ran it, it opened up on my command prompt, and the only thing on the prompt line was a bunch of zeros and ones. Okay. Sir, do you have an antivirus software? Yeah, I do. It just doesn't work well. Well, run a quick virus scan and tell me what it picks up on, please. Okay, I'm doing it right now.
He begins running the virus scan in the background, and he's still on the phone. So I ask him something.
Sir, is the command prompt still open? If so, can you list off the zeros and ones? Yeah. The zeros and ones go off as 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0.
Yes, he said every 0 and 1. I typed each number into a binary translator as he said them.
Okay, thank you, sir.
I translated it during the call. It was Russian. It said, jdet, тебя. Hell awaits you. What the heck? I was genuinely asking myself what that even meant. Hell awaits you. Then I started to think, is Satan waiting for my inevitable death? Am I going to die today? The person hung up the phone. His virus scan found something and erased it, thankfully. After work, I was afraid to go home, seeing as the ominous hell awaits you was still in the back of my mind. For the rest of the week, nothing became of that. Well, for me. The caller, though, that's a different story. On Saturday, a man was found dead with a gunshot wound straight through the side of his head. His house was not robbed. The only thing robbed was the man's life. Then I thought about the message. That message wasn't directed at me. It was directed to the man. The man was found to be, actually, a Soviet informant. He was supposed to give the United States some information about the Soviet Union in the late 60s, early 70s, that could strike at the heart of it and destroy the Soviet Union from the inside and out. The Soviet government had found out about this and had been hunting for him around the entire globe. The media learned about this because of a note he left in his drawer that he wrote in 1986. Finally, they had found him, 2 decades after the Soviet Union collapsed in on itself. I can barely sleep anymore, knowing that the man I talked to was, 1, a Soviet informant who could have either ended the Cold War or created a nuclear holocaust, and 2, a dead man killed by the Russian government itself. I still love working at tech support. I just can't get this out of my mind.
Drug, другой by Through Cracker.
I'm sure all of you, being the denizens of the internet that you are, have seen the Drugs meme that has been going around. It's not much to look at, a grainy photo of some monstrous thing with the Russian word Drugs superimposed in white text. It's become a meme because of the Russian word and the connotations Russia has and has always had. It rarely has nothing to do with the word Drugs, which, as any Russian student knows, means friend. We were making fun of this in Russian class the other day. Somebody mentioned the meme, somebody else rattled off exactly what the creature was. A Fallout New Vegas deathclaw apparently, and we all had a good laugh. But it got me thinking. Something that always confused me at the beginning of my studies was that the word другой, which contains the word drugs, means different. It didn't make any sense after all. Why would the adjectival form of friend mean different? After a quick look at Wiktionary, the answer was revealed. Drugs is also the mostly disused short adjectival form of drugoi, only showing up in a few phrases. Short adjectives denote things that are temporary. Apparently, Russia no longer had the need for temporary differences. I filed this knowledge away for later and carried on with my life. By the time the next exam rolled around and project season arrived, I had little concern for the nuances of drugs. In fact, I had nearly forgotten the word. I was working on a presentation about the false Dimitris in the library, surrounded by a comfortable nest of old books with pre-reform orthography and a multitude of coffee mugs, when I came across a book that I hadn't noticed in my earlier perusals of the shelf. It didn't seem to relate to my topic. The title was worn off, the spine was falling apart, but I grabbed it anyway. At the time, I probably had a good reason. I set it down carefully on the table and opened it to the title page. Drugs, drugs, it said in large block type. I stopped, stared. This didn't make any sense. Friend, friend? No, it couldn't be. It was a published book. Then the second meaning clicked. A different friend. A temporarily different friend. I shuddered without knowing why, and turned the page. It was clumsily written in what appeared to be a child's print. This was neither typed nor properly written out in cursive. Large, misshapen D's loomed next to broken F's and shattered SCH's. Verbs were misconjugated. Adjectives were wrongly declined. This was, in other words, a nightmare of a book. I pressed on.
Vasily Pavlovich, it is said, once had a friend. They were 2 peas in a pod, thick as thieves. They traveled together, lived together, fought together, and in all respects were as tightly bound as vines to an old oak tree. There was nothing that could separate them, or so they thought.
I turned the page.
One day, though, while traveling through the forests, Vaisa and his Drugs met a different friend. This Drugs was very Drugs indeed. He was tall, bent like an old board, and quite strange. Vasya's Drugs did not like him, and told him squarely so.
This page had a corner missing, so I couldn't grab it correctly to turn it.
Vasya's Drugs was never seen again.
I shivered. This text was the only thing on the next page. The author clearly wanted his point made. To stop my shivering, I threw on a coat and continued.
Luckily for Vasya, though, he and his Drugs became closer than he and his Drugs had been. They became a common sight around the village. Young, bright-eyed Vasily Pavlovich and his horrid, bent, ashen-grey Drugs. None of the village could understand why they were Druzia, because they were all fools.
That last bit was written much darker. The author had used too much ink, or perhaps gotten irritated with something. I was still shivering. Somebody must have forgotten to turn the heat on.
They carried on in this way for some time, becoming closer and closer, until one day, one fateful frigid winter's day, they passed the final hurdle and became drugom.
The final words were typed, but in such a large font they completely covered the last page. Drugom, with one another. Or, for a more literal meaning, one with another. Different with different, becoming in the end the same. I shuddered again. Frost was forming on the spines of the books around me. What was going on? From behind me, I heard a leathery laugh.
Duh.
It creaked. You. I turned my head in horror and smiled. I have a friend. Drugom.
I won't give a long backstory, because it doesn't matter. Basically, he got a job through a former schoolmate of his, who worked in some mid-level party position. Father was always down on his luck, and this time was no different. At this time, his friend Igor happened to see him at the local bar. They got to talking, and Igor pulled some strings and gave him the position. Didn't matter that he wasn't qualified. Half the guys aren't, he was told. Anyway, Dad started working there in 1984 and did a pretty good job. He did as he was told. Most of it was just checking dial readouts and making sure pipes were sealed and whatnot. In late 1985 and early 1986, he started noticing far more party representatives coming in and out of the plant. Usually the visits were limited to compliance officers and hazardous material supervisors when radioactive material was moved in or out. But these weren't plant specialists. They looked like Politburo. He told me he recognized a couple of them from television speeches, but he didn't remember the names. He just knew they were high-ranking. On the night of meltdown, Dad was doing his usual valve and dial checks when Politburo members, accompanied by soldiers with loaded Kalashnikovs, streamed down the hall toward the reactor area. The soldiers were wearing radiation suits of all things. The party members weren't. He tagged along a few dozen meters away and went on a catwalk high up where he could see all of them. They crowded around cooling pools. Dad made an effort to act as if he was staring at the pressure readouts in front of him, vaguely noticing they were rising as he watched. This was around the point when the lights cut out. Apparently, this wasn't abnormal for the plant. The electrical systems were under-maintained, and all of the electricians on staff were tasked with more critical reactor work. Even with the lights not working, Cherenikov radiation cast its characteristic blue glow over the group and illuminated the politicians and soldiers. The water in the pool started moving. Now, Father wasn't a nuclear engineer. Still, he knew whatever was happening in the pool was abnormal. He'd been by the area plenty of times, and never once did the water move like it did right then. It sloshed with turbidity and looked like it was coming to a rolling boil. He glanced at the dials in front of him and saw the temperature and pressure in the loop system was dramatically higher than it should have been. As he was beginning to sprint across the catwalk toward the nearest alarm station, he saw something that made him stop. What he told me then didn't make much sense at first. You have to figure someone running at a dead sprint to pull an emergency alarm at the nuclear power plant station wouldn't stop for anything. But he stopped. And he stared. Something had floated to the top of the boiling water. The way he described it, it was dark, grayish red, almost shaped like a person, but much bigger and dreadfully deformed. It floated face down in the pool. The party members didn't react, but the soldiers raised their rifles at the thing until one of the politicians barked order at them to stand down. A moment or two later, and the thing crawled out of the pool and raised itself on thick legs to stand before the gathered crowd. What Father said he remembered most about the thing was its head. It sat directly on top of its lopsided shoulders, and it had no eyes, no ears, no nose. All that was there was a gaping hole. Not even a mouth, but a hole. And inside, the same blue glow from the pool shone out onto the faces of the people surrounding it. Someone else at the plant must have noticed the temperature and pressure abnormalities and pulled the alarm, because sirens began to blare and diesel generators were galvanized into action to force the cooling cycle into overdrive. None of that mattered to Father, though. He said the thing approached the soldiers, one by one, and without any of them putting up a fight, it pressed the hole in its face against the top of each of their heads, and they started to dissolve. First their suits melted, and then their skin began to blister and char. The thing moved its maw downward until it nearly reached their legs, which dropped to the ground in smoldering heap. It then did the same to the assembled Politburo, all but one. She stood in the middle of the pile of streaming legs and heaps and crotches and stared at the atrocity. Then she screamed at it. It's something Father said he's repeated to himself every day since. Zalitso na poshve, salt of the earth. As the words left her mouth, the Geiger counter Father was forced to carry with him at all times exploded into life. At the same instant, the politician burst into flames. He could swear she smiled as she burned. All this was finally enough for Dad to make a break for it. He knew he'd been irradiated badly, but he took some solace in the fact that the ticks in the counter slowed quickly as he left the pool area. Right before he was clear of the room, he took one last glimpse at the thing. It had begun to melt. As soon as its body began pouring through the metal grate, the water below erupted in a mass of superheated steam. Father avoided being scalded to death by about half a second when he turned the corner and slammed the door behind him. The rest of the meltdown played out more or less like it was eventually reported. Father was able to get out before the main explosions. He lived with the profound guilt of running by his colleagues, who still didn't know something truly catastrophic was about to happen. He believed his thyroid cancer was payment for his indifference toward them during his escape. The iconic photograph of the radioactive elephant's foot in the basement of the power plant stood framed on his dresser for the rest of his life. As he told me this story, he confessed he kept it to remind him of the implications of the politician's words before she was devoured by the flames. That thing will render the area around it uninhabitable for 100 years, he sighed. It's melting through the ground, even today. If it hits the groundwater, it'll explode like a dirty bomb and make the disaster in '86 look like a firecracker. Russia, Europe, North Africa, all irradiated. He died a couple of days after he shared his experience with me. I just have no idea what to do with it all. Obviously, he couldn't have made the whole thing up, but I don't know why he would. He doesn't have anything to gain now that he's gone. Maybe some of the other survivors or their kids can corroborate parts of what he said. Maybe they can't. Either way, if it's true, there is so much more going on with that disaster than we've been told. Even now, as that radioactive slag melts into the ground, Father's story almost makes it sound like the meltdown was just a precursor to something far worse. Something plotted. Please, if anyone can give some advice or insight, it would be appreciated. I don't want what he told me to be true, but Zalitzona Porshva terrifies me more than I can bear. I live in Russia, and the government has turned my town into some kind of sick experiment. There's really no other way to put it. I wasn't one of the people to be afraid of the government, but now I'm genuinely terrified of them. I live on one of 2 islands in the Sea of Okhotsk. They were once part of the same fishing town. 2 years ago, every form of outside communication failed to work here. A week later, 2 Russian military ships showed up and surrounded the 2 islands. They sat there in harbor for days, shooting anyone that tried to pass by. On the 5th day, a small boat was sent to shore. We were told the rest of the world had been infected by a virus, and that we were the only ones that had survived. The story was clearly a lie, and we knew that from the start. I was making my way back to my house from the local grocery store when I heard the news. None of it made any sense. Over the next week, soldiers raided the islands, taking any form of technology we had. In an instant, our lives had been taken over. We were all forced to leave our homes, being jammed in an old rundown hotel. They gave us all jobs to keep the community alive. I was in the lead of 7 fishing boats. Now I pull a damn hole. The other island has gone dark. We have not heard from them in a while. Every time it rains, we can hear screams carry across the water. Last year, I was even beginning to believe the lies. I was having the right thoughts. Maybe this is what's best. They're keeping us safe. That week, a plane flew over the island. People began to try to resist once again. It was like when they first arrived. Quickly, the soldiers began to take some of them onto the small boats, taking the people to the other island. Like a prison, there are people here that bribe the soldiers. Last month, someone got a phone call. They cried as they called their family, trying to explain our situation as fast as they could. It only took minutes for the soldiers to find her and put her on a boat. I was there. I saw it, but no one believes me. I think they do, but they just don't want to. I honestly don't know what to do. I am a prisoner. At sometimes I feel so close to escaping. I run the idea over in my head. I just need to contact the right person. But it's not possible. I killed a guard yesterday. They're already coming for me. I tried calling my family on the man's phone, but they didn't answer. Instead, another family did. I'm trying to write this as fast as I can. Please, please, someone help me. Help the people here. We are near 5644. Please, tell people. This is wrong. People can't live like this. I'm begging you. Help.
In the early 1950s, Stalinist KGB researchers kept 5 political dissidents who were deemed by court psychiatrists to have inflexibility of convictions. As they were the nucleus of the Ukrainian anti-communist underground, they were spared the gulags and reserved for special research. Test subjects in the psychiatric ward in Kazan. They were used as part of an infantry combat alertness program, or PNP, kept awake for 15 days using a prototype gas-based stimulant. After being bathed, deloused, and fed a crude last meal, they were placed in a sealed environment, an old bomb shelter modified for scientific observation. The room was reinforced, wired, and sealed so Soviet researchers could carefully monitor the subjects' conditions. The gas, thought to be toxic in very high concentrations, was mixed with pure oxygen to prolong their lives. As this was before closed-circuit cameras, the subjects were monitored with crude microphones and 3 narrow glass portholes drilled into the chamber walls. The prisoners' quarters had been stocked with books, cots without bedding, running water, a single toilet, and enough dried food rations to last all 5 for a month. Everything proceeded as expected for the first 6 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been falsely promised that each would gain their freedom if they submitted to the anti-sleep gas, ate the food, and kept themselves awake for a promised 30 days. All conversations and activities were monitored day and night via shifts of expert scientists. By the 7th day, it was noted that the dissidents began to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their pasts. Day 8 marked a general degradation in the optimism of their conversations. On the 9th morning, scientists heard the patients complaining about their circumstances and the events that led them to where they were. By that evening, they were demonstrating severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and staring out the one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 10 days, the first of them started screaming. As though he were in mortal danger, he ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs. He screamed for nearly 3 hours without taking a breath, and without interruption from his comrades. As the night came, he continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional groans. The researchers postulated that he had torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior was how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, the lack thereof. The others continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. Observers of the chamber noted that the rest took books apart and smeared page after page with their own feces, pasting them calmly over the glass portholes. When their task was done, the screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. The chamber went silent. After 3 more days passed, the researchers began checking the microphones hourly to make sure they were working. They felt it impossible that the place could remain silent with 5 people inside. Oxygen consumption indicated that all the prisoners were still alive. In fact, the consumption levels of both the anti-fatigue gas and oxygen matched those of people during strenuous exercise. This worried the researchers immensely. On the morning of the 17th day, furious debate ensued among the researchers as to what to do with the living yet silent subjects. It was decided to offer them a bribe. Using the intercom inside the chamber, they announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door, lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of your company his immediate freedom." To the shock of the researchers, one of the subjects responded with a single, whispered phrase. "We no longer want to be free." The room again fell silent. The only sound came from an occasional shift in pressure of the chamber pipes. Debate continued among the researchers and the military advisors funding the research over how to proceed with the experiment. Some thought that it was still worth pursuing, while others refused, fearing the ominous nature of the early results. After continued failure to provoke response from the prisoners, it was decided to open the chamber that evening. At midnight, the chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and oxygen mix, then filled with fresh air. Immediately, voices over the microphones began to object. 3 of the subjects began begging, pleading as if for the sake of loved ones for the gas to be turned back on. These new protests prompted the scientists finally to intervene. They sent an armed retinue to retrieve the test subjects. Naturally, they hoped to prevent compromise of the entire program. At the approach of the soldiers, what sounded like 3 of the prisoners began to scream even louder, while a 4th beat against the walls with some metal-like object. The clang of the metal and concrete created a hideous, almost tribal-like din with the screams. Yet the prisoners were not the only ones the researchers heard scream. Moments later, the embedded microphones detected additional howls, those of the soldiers who cried out at what lay inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although none who saw them could bear to call their state life. The food rations past those marked for day 5 had not been so much as touched. The body of subject 5 had been torn to pieces. Chunks of his chest and flesh from his thighs seemed to have been stuffed into the drain in the chamber's center, allowing 4 inches of reddish fluid to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of that fluid was blood was never determined. All 4 surviving subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies as well. Examination of the destroyed flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated wounds of self-infliction caused by each victim's own teeth. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all living subjects had been removed. While the heart, the lungs, and the diaphragm remained in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been peeled off, thus exposing their moving lungs beneath the ribcage. Stomachs, spleens, livers, and intestines lay fanned out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. Each digestive tract continued to function, macerating food as though intact. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was flesh they had ripped off their dead comrade and eaten over the course of days. Though most of the soldiers were hardened graduates from Moscow's finest training facilities, many refused to return to the chamber or remove the test subjects, who continued to scream to be left in the chamber. This, they said, they could not face. However, threats from their superiors compelled some to return to the victims and remove them. But these, when touched, alternately begged, later demanded that the gas be turned back on. Their reason left many speechless, lest they fall asleep. Though little more than self-dissected ghosts, the test subjects fought fiercely during the removal process. One of the guards died from throat injuries while stooping to hoist a prisoner. Another was gravely injured in the groin and bled out from an iliac artery after being severely bitten. 5 more followed, subsequently committing suicide in the weeks following the incident. During the struggle, one subject's spleen ruptured. He bled out almost immediately. Physicians tried to sedate him, but this proved impossible. Though injected with more than 10 times the safe dose of a morphine derivative, he still resisted, breaking the ribs and one arm of a doctor. Technically, the prisoner bled to death, yet his heart continued to beat for a full 2 minutes after. Long after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail, struggling to attack anyone within reach like an embittered animal. He repeatedly gasped the word "more" over and over, becoming weaker and weaker until he fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords begged for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most severely injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back into his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had given him in preparation for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was applied to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through one of the leather restraints on his wrists, even with a 100-kilogram soldier holding him down. It took 4 more times the standard dose of anesthetic to put him under. The instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. The autopsy later showed that his blood had highly toxic levels of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group to start screaming in the beginning of the experiment. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to verbally object to surgery, but he reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when a reluctant surgeon suggested that they attempt an operation without the anesthetic. Over the course of the 6-hour procedure to repair the self-mutilation, the subject never once blinked. He merely stared at intervals at the doctors, a peaceful expression on his taut face. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One nurse who assisted the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's twisted mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at his saviors and began to wheeze loudly, struggling to talk. Assuming the prisoner must have something of drastic importance to say, the surgeon instructed an assistant to procure writing materials so the patient could communicate. His message was simple: keep cutting. It was decided the last subject's surgery should be given without anesthetic also, but the surgeon found it impossible to perform his operations since the patient laughed continuously. The decision was made to inject him with a paralytic to prevent his facial muscles from moving. Once paralyzed, he followed the attending doctors with his eyes. In an abnormally short period of time, the paralytic cleared the subject's system. He tried to escape his bonds, motioning with jerks of his head for the stimulant gas that lay beside him. The researchers observing the 3 reconstructive procedures outside the operating room tried to communicate via intercom with the prisoners. The researchers asked why the 3 had injured themselves, why they had eviscerated their abdominal organs and flesh. They asked why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: "We must remain awake." The remaining 2 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber to await determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. But the commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, both stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point, they were extremely desperate to stay awake. The subject that could speak was humming loudly and continuously smiling. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again as if for something to focus on. This subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves with the greatest interest. The waves were normal most of the time, but flatlined inexplicably as though the subject was experiencing a cyclical brain death and then strange regeneration. As the researchers focused on the pings and troughs on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, one nurse saw his eyes slip shut one final time. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep. This was followed by a surge, and then silence from the machine as his heartbeat ceased. As soon as his brainwaves subsided, his seizure began, and he was suddenly spraying blood from every open wound. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in with the gas. His brain showed the same flat lines as the recently dead subject. To the horror of those monitoring the EEG, the overseeing military official obliged the last subject, giving the order to seal the chamber with 3 of the scientists inside. One of the now doomed 3 drew a concealed Makarov and shot at the commander through the porthole glass. But the round merely ricocheted, burying itself within the torso of the now dead mute subject. Fearing for their lives, the other 2 researchers lunged for the gun, as if its possession might win either their freedom. Yet neither the woman or the man made it. Each fell, shot dead at point-blank range. The murderous scientist turned and aimed at the last subject. "I won't be locked in here with the gas. I won't die here with you," he shrieked. "What are you? I must know." The subject smiled, pivoting its pale head. "Have you forgotten so easily?" It foamed. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within your mind, begging to be set free at every moment from your deepest animal consciousness. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then fired at the subject's exposed chest. The EEG flatlined as it weakly choked out, "So merely free."
My name is Alyssa, and I am from Russia, although I do not remember where in specific. I have been moved around very much in my life. I was born to an angry alcoholic and an ill woman. Although I can't remember her face or her name, I can remember so clearly her telling me, "Alyssa, you are my miracle child. Never forget it." I never have, and I never will. My mother died sometime when I was either 10 or 11. My father's heart was broken, but it only made him crueler. He beat me ruthlessly for a year before becoming bored of me and selling me to a man for no more than what would be considered about $6 American. This man, in turn, put me into a large home with about 6 other girls, my age and older. At the time, I thought I had been orphaned. I know now that it was a waiting home for Russian brides. Although it's practiced much less, some men, mostly American, would rather go to Russia and marry their bride there than do the whole mail-order bride thing, which I never heard of until I moved to America. Many men would come and go. Some girls would go with them. Some stayed a little longer. We were taught very little English, but enough to entertain the men when they came. They thought we were funny. I lived in that home for an additional 2 years before I was chosen. The man of the home even joked that they would begin prostituting me had I started to mature any more. The man that chose me was nothing special. I will call him Stephen. He was a tall, thin American man. He was a bit pale and a little older, but I tried my best to smile. Girls who don't smile would often get abused much more. We traveled to many countries together, and his sexual appetites never waned. With every new place we visited, there were more child prostitutes or other brides with husbands who liked to watch. I couldn't have been more than 14 during my first orgy. I vomited afterwards. Stephen had said to me,
"You'll get used to it."
A year later, Stephen announced that we would be moving to America. By this time, I could speak fluent English, along with Spanish and French, and a little Japanese. Enough to say, "Yes, sir, I want some more." Days before we were to board the plane, he announced that he would be picking up a second bride. You would be surprised at how common it is for these men to take a second and even a third bride. I felt sick, thinking that another girl would have to deal with what I did. But when I met her, something was off. She was a little bit older than me, maybe 15 or 16. She didn't seem frightened or nervous. She wore bright red lipstick and smiled a lot. I couldn't tell what ethnicity she was. She spoke very fluent English though, and her accent seemed to almost be a mix of several. She was so kind to me. Her name was Clara. We returned to America and arrived at his home. It is a small, one-story little house with 3 bedrooms. He had set up a room for us that had many things that a normal teenage girl would have. A little later that evening, Stephen began to drink, and I became very nervous. Stephen wasn't necessarily a mean drunk. He just became very sexual. He instructed the both of us to lie on the king-size bed and strip each other down. She didn't even blink. He continued to instruct us to do different things when Clara spoke up. "Come here, my love," she said as she wriggled an enticing finger, beckoning him towards the bed. "I want to play a game." I noticed something in her eyes seemed off. She gave me an almost sympathetic look. "Alyssa, please move off the bed for a moment. I want to show our love something." Stephen seemed very surprised and very pleased. I did as instructed and moved off the bed and stood against the wall. She had him lie on his back while she straddled him. She whispered, no, almost hissed, "Do you want to know a secret?" He nodded excitedly. She sighed, took one more look at me, and then let out an inhuman scream. Just at that moment, her mouth shot open, and I know it sounds crazy, but sharp, monstrous teeth shot out from above her normal teeth. In one quick motion, she bent down and ripped out Stephen's throat before he could even react. I could barely breathe, and at that moment I thought I might die. However, Clara looked at me with that same sympathetic look, and I noticed she was no longer straddling him, but crouched over him in an animalistic way. "Go, darling, you are free," she said as the teeth receded and her body relaxed. "This devil has no power over you anymore." I stared for a moment, but I had wanted freedom for so long, and I bolted and never looked back. I never saw Clara, whatever she was, again. I ran and ran and ran until a cop finally picked me up, but by then I could barely speak. After that night, I was passed around from youth home to youth home before finally being fostered into a permanent home until adulthood. During that time, I went to a normal high school. I learned to be a normal girl. I had foster parents that knew of my past. Other than that one night, they only knew that Clara had helped me escape, and they took extra special care to help me recover and enter society as a normal woman. I never got that night out of my mind. Now I am 24. I am a college graduate, and I work for an organization to help emancipate women like myself. Those who were brides like myself, young girls sold into the sex trade, and even battered women. I had almost forgotten that night, until yesterday. I was put on a new case, a young Swedish girl. She called herself Lova. She seemed much more shaken than usual. While she told her story, she mentioned that her sister bride had helped her escape. A sister bride named Clara, with a beautiful smile and red lipstick.